Started. It is now 12 o'clock. Hello and welcome to NCCASA's webinar, Love with Accountability, Digging Up the Roots of Child Sexual Abuse. I am Gabriella Nyman, NCCASA's Training and Communication Specialist. During this webinar, if you would like to ask a question, please feel free to type them into the chat box. It is my honor to introduce our presenter today. Aishah Shaida Simmons is an award-winning Black feminist lesbian cultural worker who for over 25 years has examined the intersections of race, gender, sexuality, and sexual violence. She is the producer and director of the Ford Foundation-funded groundbreaking documentary film, No, the Rape Documentary, and the cutting-edge anthology, Love with Accountability, Digging Up the Roots of Child Sexual Abuse. Aishah's work is informed by her lived experiences as a child sexual abuse survivor, adult rape survivor, and Buddhist practitioner committed to disrupting and ending the inhumane humanely. Aishah will talk about how the anthology prioritizes compassionately disrupting and ending child sexual abuse. Two of the anthology's contributors, NCCASA's Executive Director, Monika Johnson-Hostler, and NCCASA's Women of Color Leadership and Resource Sharing Project Technical Assistance Provider Tracy Wright will join Aishah and share about their chapter that highlights the power of mentorship to heal, transform, and impact future generations. Aishah, thank you for being here, and I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Gabriella. Appreciate it. And thank you, NCCASA, for hosting me again. Three's a charm. This is my third webinar, and I'm really the previous ones were great, and I'm especially excited about this one today because I get to co-present, engage in conversation with both Monika and Tracy. So I'm going to talk just a little about the anthology, just to create the context for our I want to say fireside chat, but I'll just say virtual chat. You know, like we're really looking forward to having a conversation. So I am, as Gabriella shared, the editor of the anthology, Love with Accountability, Digging Up the Roots of Child Sexual Abuse. And there is the cover. And it is, I always say, I've been vacillating. I've been like, is it 44 contributors or 40? And I realized yesterday, there are 40 chapters, but some of the chapters, a couple have more than one contributor. And then there's the foreword and then my introduction. So Tracy and Monika, they co-authored their chapter. So it's actually 44 diasporic Black contributors writing about disrupting and ending child sexual abuse. And there are 40 chapters total. So as I always try to remember, is to begin with land acknowledgement. And, you know, we're all scattered because of technology. I am located in what is, I should say, the land of the Piscataway and Pamunkey peoples, which is known as Washington, D.C., but this is their land. This is the indigenous land. And I just always believe that it is imperative that we acknowledge the land that we're seated on, that we acknowledge that this land was taken by force, and that there are peoples, nations, indigenous nations who are still fighting for recognition. So much of it has been lost. So much of the indigenous land has been lost as a result of white supremacy. And I believe that it is imperative that we acknowledge that. And as an African descended person, you know, it's such a complicated history, not in terms of the relationship to the land, acknowledgement that this is indigenous land, has been for centuries, millennia. And then as descendant of trafficked people, when we talk about human trafficking, we don't talk often about enslavement as a form of trafficking. So trafficking of African people to work on the land, not only in the United States, but throughout the Americas, from Alaska on down to Argentina, to work the land for centuries for free. So it is a very deep connection to this land ancestrally and also out of deep respect for the indigenous people. So just really want to begin with that acknowledgement. And with that share, the introduction, my introduction starts there in terms of libation, word libation, of honoring the land, honoring indigenous nations, honoring enslaved African people. So, and also honoring breath. Let me just say that throughout every 5 chapters, there is my call, invocation to say breathe, because breath, as we know, is sacred and is definitely not guaranteed, as we've just been most recently privy to. And not only with George Floyd, because definitely we witnessed, or those of us who watched the video, his breath just being taken out from him by white supremacy. But also Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Tony Dade, the list goes on with Black people, not just men, but Black women, Black trans folks, gender non-binary people. So breath is very, very, it's sacred, and we must fight for it, hopefully compassionately. So my goal for this anthology was and is to provide multiple roadmaps that explore how we can disrupt, end, and prevent child sexual abuse. I am a survivor of child sexual abuse and also of adult rape. And really, statistics show that for many who've been abused as children, that we have a higher chance of being assaulted as adults. And that's exactly what happened to me. I told my parents what happened, what was going on when I was 10 years old, what my grandfather was doing, and they did not remove me from the situation. So I was left to navigate my way through the trauma. And my parents were and still are very engaged activists in human rights movements, and my grandparents provided the safe home, right, while my parents were on the road nationally and internationally. And in that safe space, I was violated. And it's, child sexual abuse is so complicated because most of us know who's causing us the harm, and we love the person who's causing us the harm. So it's not like a stranger. It is not like the police officer where, you can just be like, ban, get out. It's our loved ones. And so for me, my question has been and will always be, how do we disrupt and end the inhumane humanely? So I just want to read just a few paragraphs from the book, and then I want to segue into conversation with Tracy and Monika, because I believe that they, along with many of the contributors, provide a roadmap and exemplify ways in which, not necessarily that they disrupted the child sexual abuse that occurred, but really provide a roadmap for healing, and then also hopefully to create work that hopefully disrupts and ends for future generations. So the writings in this anthology have emerged from the lived experiences of a collective of diasporic Black child sexual abuse survivors, advocates, and one former bystander, my mother. The anthology includes most of the texts that were originally published in the Feminist Wire, which in 2016 I curated an online forum called Love with Accountability. And there were some revisions to those, but there was about, I think, 31 or 20, between 25 and 30, I can't remember exactly, contributions in this online forum in 2016. But now the anthology includes 15 new contributions, in which Tracy and Monika are part of the new voices to the anthology. I was unable to cover all of the perspectives that I hoped for, but I'm grateful for my sibling comrades who are part of this anthologized journey. I'm especially grateful for my mother's efforts to not only be accountable to me for what I endured, but also to be publicly accountable through her contribution to this volume, through which she underscores the detrimental impact of parents and caregivers not believing their children. Many of the contributions in this anthology do not believe in police involvement in response to child sexual abuse. However, there are several who believe that we must make use of what few resources exist while we co-create something different for the future. Despite my core beliefs that the imperative need to completely dismantle the criminal injustice system and abolish the prison industrial complex, I intentionally include diverse perspectives that aren't necessarily in agreement with each other in this anthology. I believe it is important to be in compassionate conversation with people who do not hold the same perspectives, but share a goal of naming, disrupting, and ultimately ending child sexual abuse with other forms of violence. It is my affirmation that every single one of us will make the commitment to refrain from marginalizing or worse, condoning child sexual abuse or any other form of gender-based violence in the name of any greater issue, which in communities of color often means solely focusing on white supremacy. Having your body violated and invaded against your will as a child and also as an adult is a non-negotiable atrocity that must be addressed. The eradication of racism and white supremacy alone will not make our families and communities safe. We should not have to be murdered by white vigilantes, the police, or any other apparatus of the state in order for our communities to believe that harm has been committed. For many survivors of child sexual abuse, physical death is not necessarily the worst thing that can happen to us, especially when we have to engage with our harm doers over and over again without any form of accountability. What I've learned so far through this work and through my own personal journey is that love with accountability is hard. Perhaps nothing is harder, but it is worth the struggle. Child sexual abuse by its nature is complex, and together we must co-create accountability systems that honor that complexity. And until we do, we will not end the epidemic. So I will stop there with my words and bring in Tracy and Monika for us to talk about their chapter, which is such a, for me, I see it as a call and response on page. And the title of it is The Vanguard of Love, Accountability, and the Young Advocates Institute, and You and I. So I want to open it up, Tracy and Monika, to ask you all about the writing process for contributing to this anthology.
Thank you for one, agreeing to do this kind of 3-part series for NCCASA. So I appreciate you lending your voice, time, and talents to our membership and those who've been joining all now your 3rd series for NCCASA. Personally, for me, I think when you extended the offer to Tracy and I said to Tracy, oh my gosh, I'm the talker, not the writer. That is also a huge part of our relationship, Tracy and I's relationship as well. So we really, one, we're overwhelmed and excited to agree to be a part of this, mostly because we know so many of the comrades who were co-authors in this. So for us, it was also, I think I can speak for both of us. For us, it was absolutely kind of both overwhelming, but also an honor to be in community in your book with all the people that we know, love, and adore, and do this work alongside for decades. Many of the co-authors in this anthology I've worked with for many decades at this point. So that's the first thing I'll say is, after getting over the shock, awe, and great appreciation, we both agreed on the title, which I'll let Tracy talk a little bit more about the title, because that was definitely her creativity. And then we started our writing journey.
Absolutely. Again, I echo those sentiments from Monika and the totality of NCCASA. Thank you so much for sharing space with us in multiple ways. Greatly appreciative of those things. And absolutely, we were overwhelmed. I think in true transparency, I think my acceptance was totally inappropriate. And then I had to code switch and come back and be like, oh, yes, let me professionalize this. Like, no, this is amazing and this is great. So much so, and being so excited about it. Remembering the pages drive. I think I drove the book around in my car the night before it was officially released. Like, I was just super excited in multiple ways. And when you start thinking about the title, it really is, it's the essence of YAI. It's the essence of Monika and I's relationship. And for folks who have heard about the Young Advocates Institute, its acronym is YAI. That is what young people call it. That is, their brand, not ours, theirs. And so if you break down those letters, it really is about you and I. It really is about relationship. It really is about the relationships we should have with each other in this work. And it's about our relationship. And it's so many things. It's a journey in leadership development. It is, for me, I think it's also a love letter to myself, about love with accountability. It's a love letter to Monika as an investor, and a friend, and a mentor and a guide, and our greatest hope for young people who engage in the Institute, and not only young people who engage in it, but young people about transformation and unconditional agape love.
So, Tracy, I want to get into the chapter, but before we do, can you briefly, for people who don't know, just share what YAI is?
Absolutely. The Young Advocates Institute is a social justice offering that brings together 200 young people from across North Carolina for a weekend of leadership development, prevention education seminars. And I will say that work is not guided by adults. It really is young people co-creating and leading spaces and calling for conversations that they hope to have. And so it's a project that's been in existence for 9 years, and it's been replicated in other states. And it truly is one of those things that is hard and amazing at the same time. And so that is what YAI is to me.
And the origins, I mean, you all talk about it in the anthology in your chapter. So in terms of leading up to how do we get to YAI? What was that trajectory? And that's, I think, is so beautiful about your chapter, that you all really, again, in that call and response, talk about how you got here. And so I don't know who's, I know, Monika, you said you're not the talker, but whoever wants to.
I am the talker, but actually,
excuse me.
Actually talks certainly more than I do now.
I do. I do.
Yes, you actually do. And I'm actually, I thought Tracy was going to talk about the origins, but which I'm surprised she spent the time on the definition and not the origin.
I know, she's being shy. I don't know.
Because it's, of course, the origins are really the basis of the chapter, and more importantly, the origins are also pretty much, I would say, identical to the origins of our relationship together as well with each other. And so Tracy came to NCCASA as an intern from Shaw University, and pretty much ate candy for probably about 2 weeks before working. Lots of candy.
This was this was a while ago, right? This wasn't recently.
Yes. She's still young, not that young, but yes.
2001.
Yes. Yeah, literally 20 years we've almost known each other.
Mm-hmm.
But she finished up her internship, went to get her master's, and I offered her to come back to NCCASA for a job. And, you know, Tracy really saw herself as a creative, not a doer. And so YI really was one of her creative geniuses that was very personal to her. And I'll let her share the personal piece of that to her. And she brought it to me, and I said to her what I said to her in most cases, which is the root of our love with accountability relationship is, that sounds great. I would love to do that. I brought youth work to NCCASA with me when I came, because when I came to NCCASA, I was also in my early 20s. And for me, it was such a huge part of the way that I wanted to do my work, is to invest in primarily young Black and brown people, to really fully understand and engage in the anti-sexual violence movement, because it wasn't something I knew or understood until it impacted my life personally. That I understood that there was this whole field and all of these organizations that could be contributing to a community that I was a part of that knew nothing about this entire collective of people who were invested in this work. And so when Tracy brought the concept to me for this youth summer camp, I looked at her and said, that's a great idea, but I don't see a plan here. And so when you bring me a plan, then we can do it. And I can say, and this is what I'll pass it off to her, that statement was hard for her. And I knew she felt completely broken by me telling her no. But ultimately, the no is about, you can't implement something just because you have an idea. And that really started our entire relationship around love and accountability, that I adore you, and it is a creative genius idea, but you can't walk into your boss's office with an idea without a plan. And so I would say that our entire relationship has been there.
Absolutely. And the origins, the origins and how, which is where when we were even discussing with Aishah about what this was, we were able to say, this is connected to childhood sexual abuse, because I do my work every day as a survivor. And when you think about the origin of YI, in my probably then 25-year-old self, was completely arrogant in, like, I want to create this because I want to make sure nobody has to experience my experience. I think the other tenets of that I have to acknowledge is understanding that up until that point had never talked about my victimization before I got to NCCASA. The fullest disclosure that I've ever given to anybody has been Monika. And yes, I did come into her office and ask for this space to create this thing so young people would never have to go through the trauma and have all of these things and not know that this was a crime and harmful, and that it was a violation. And I went into her office and the idea lay dormant for 6 years. Like, it was 6 years from the initial conversation until the actual launching of YI, right? And so I think that's also important, because I think there was just so many things that I had to do, and had to do it in relationship, and had the accountability and the investment from Monika to really do to work through my stuff in multiple ways in regards to victimization, trauma that's associated with childhood sexual abuse. And the moment that a kid showed up on that campus in 2012, it was never about me ever again. And thereby, all of our practices today, right, are rooted in love with accountability. I think that we've been able to transfer that to the young people who show up at the Institute, even before we even had the language around love with accountability. And it is now a practice that they are accustomed to and expect, because I believe that accountability is actually probably one of the greatest forms of love that someone can experience. I love you, and I also want to hold you accountable.
And so what is that work? So the work of YAI is youth led, would you say, and driven? Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. We are guided by all things popular culture, hip hop culture, to broker and have conversations, and that creative genius comes from young people. No matter how hard I attempt to hold on to my youth, I'm not that cool no more. And so I am guided by their truth and their experiences. I still try to hold on a little bit, and I am moving into a different level of adulthood where I'm also a little bit embarrassed. And even when I say, oh yeah, y'all on the Snappy chat, and they're like, oh my God, I wish you stopped. But you know, that's my truth and how I get the permission to show up for in young people's lives. Like, I don't have any children of my own, but I am a part of so many kids' villages who have added a texture to my life that I never could have experienced. And so for that, I'm always grateful for that.
Yeah.
Well, I know, I mean, I had the opportunity to work with NCCASA, God, like it feels like a lifetime ago in mid 2000s. And then I hadn't been in touch or contact. And then I reconnected at North Carolina, at the United States of Women in DC in June 2016. Our sister Comrade Luz Marquez Bimbo was responsible for my being there. And I bring it up because I was so blown away by the young people. I mean, I was just like, who presented at that during your session. I mean, it was incredible that I was just like, I want some of that. And that was before the Love with Accountability Forum. I knew I wanted to do it. That was June of 2016, and the forum happened in October. But just was really impressed, and I feel like it is such an example of the power of survivor leadership, that for you, Tracy, in terms of, you know, being able to transform your trauma into being able to give a gift as a gift to the future, that, you know, the contemporary moments, but also the future, with the hope of really being able to disrupt and end this pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
Indeed. And it's so funny, Aishah, because I actually forgot about that until you said it. And I actually remember you and I were in a workshop so I'm a very visual person. And I remember me and you and Lou sitting at the table, and you actually said to me, gosh, I can't believe I saw you. I haven't seen you since no.
Right.
And so it's all kind of flooding back to me now that we had that conversation in DC as a result of that. And, you know, I think for me, one of the things that I would say is significant is one of the things for me that also came out of YI, even while it was laying dormant, is we were doing very small steps to engage youth. Prior to me coming to NCCASA, I actually did youth engagement work in a small community, and we always had our young people. And for me, Tracy so now I can say this because Tracy and I are in the same, literally same age bracket now. And she would say to me, I mean, you're not cool. And I'm like, I'm 3 years older than you, so if I'm not cool, technically you're not either. But
accountability, I can sit in that. I'm okay.
But I say that because, you know, by the time that we took those young people to DC for the United States of Women, that was not our first entry point of taking young people outside of North Carolina. Because again, both Tracy and I are from small communities, and a part of disrupting the narrative around child sexual abuse and the secrecy in our communities, and everybody who's listening knows that this is my story, that when I took this job, my grandmother had 2 reactions. One I didn't understand at the time, which was a look of horror. And now I completely understand why she had a look of horror. But the second was, baby, Black people are not going to talk to you about this. And the place that I started was in schools and in community youth groups, because those were places that I learned my leadership was in my church and in my community. And so I went to the places where I learned my own leadership skills to really start to reinvest in those young people to disrupt and change the narrative. So disrupting child sexual abuse for me is also about ensuring that they understood that they had love inside and outside of their home. And what most young people don't have is a young adult to invest in, which is really about the mentorship for me, and investing in them so that they know if indeed something doesn't feel right, but harm doesn't come to mind or violation because you love the person, that they're able to have a trusted adult. And I would say that for me was the primary of going into this work right out of college. That's something I didn't have, and I wanted to give back to young Black folk, an adult Black woman who could mentor and hold space for them, and to be able to help change the narratives that they were being taught or experiencing. And so I would say our exposure to those young people was also exposure outside of our state, and exposure to, you are bigger than the space that you're in now, and you're bigger than your experiences you're experiencing today.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's so dope, because I think that I've always felt and I've always known that, yeah, I am from a small town. I am from a small town called Bossier City, Louisiana, right? That is rural and impoverished and disenfranchised in a number of ways. And I think that what Monika just said about giving exposure and an experience in a different just land view and purview of life and love outside of community is also a tenet of our relationship too, because I think that although we are four years apart, I'm like semantics, but I mean, yeah, I'm trying to hold on to my youth here, people. But no, like, but for real, but those are also the things that she gave me, and continues to give me as well too. So I think that that commitment, expands, and then thereby I attempt to try to hold those same spaces for young people, because I know how transformative it is to be on the receiving end of that and how it can shape your life. Like, I'm not supposed to be here having a conversation with you. Like, I'm very clear about those things, but those things that disrupted and interceded on my behalf make me humble, grateful, and overwhelmed at the same time.
And I think that particularly in this moment, but I think about, I hear that, and I think about just the work that we as advocates, survivor or not, as advocates, we have to, Black, let me be very clear, I'm sorry, that line that we're walking, right? Right, we're all aware, and if we're not, I don't know what's going on, of the virulent and rampant white supremacy happening in this country, and many of us are also aware of sexual violence, but it's not talked about in the way in which it's not like we were talking about white supremacy all the time, but it's just, it hasn't been talked about, or when it's been talked about, it's not our images, it's not our stories, it's not our faces. And so I think the another powerful reality about YAI is that for me, I see it also as intersectional, that it's dealing with the both and, so that Black youth don't have to feel like they have to choose between, well, I can only talk about white supremacy, but I can't talk about sexual violence. And then it creates opportunities to have complex conversations around, what does that mean when we know the police are killing us? So then what do we do when the violence is happening in our homes? How do we respond to it?
Mm-hmm. That's right. And you know, a large part for me around, you know, love with accountability is also in the space that we're able to hold now is around transformative justice, like really having conversations about if indeed, especially recognizing Black people, Black and brown people, and all of our complexities with and historic trauma with law enforcement, of calling law enforcement, you know, recognizing that that's also some of the trauma that the adults were holding. And in addition to, again, like I said, I recognize the horror from my grandmother's face now of your own trauma when somebody discloses child sexual abuse to you, that's near and dear to you, that the choice that adults are making who've never dealt with it is the choice to continue to suppress their own survivorship and their own trauma while listening to somebody they love and we're supposed to protect. And that's a large part for me around talking about transformative justice and accountability in Black families and in our community is, yes, we hold our own trauma right? And parents get this outside of protecting their children. And I think that's just and now that I'm a parent, I completely understand, again, the horror on my grandmother's face who raised me is you don't ever want to be sitting on the other side of some trauma that you understand, because every parent's or guardian's hope is that the next generation won't experience the same harm, hurt, and danger, and that you will somehow have protected them. And so now on the other side of this as an adult, understanding that horror is also, how did I fail you and how did I not protect you? And knowing that her generation didn't have tools other than law enforcement to actually address the harm. Mm-hmm. And so how do we all reconcile that? And for me as a parent in 2020, recognizing that I have tools that she didn't have access to, and how do I use those tools when, especially today, in talking about the fear that my own daughter is watching law enforcement abuse and harm and murder Black bodies. And so really still being able to talk to her about the importance of child sexual abuse is it's interfamilial. It's almost always we know them. And so what can accountability look like if the fear is of law enforcement, and recognizing that both of those things can be true because we're complex individuals and we don't have to ignore what's happening around white supremacy at the risk of not taking care of ourselves. And so there is nothing more important than you being whole and alive and healthy, and how to help my own child think through those things that I didn't have the opportunity to have understanding. And that's also part of changing this narrative, is that they can hold both of those truths at the same time. And so can their parents, which we've, started to add a substantial more pieces of YAI for me, especially for parents. Because as I said to Tracy, you're doing all these great things with young people, but I can tell you, as a young person who had knowledge and took it to my family, if they don't have the knowledge, you still have not fully, completely changed the narrative in our community. And so now involving adults in those conversations, because ultimately children should not, in my opinion, be responsible for their safety. We are. And so we have to be engaging and invested in adults who we know are coming to us with their own trauma in this conversation as well.
Mm-hmm. And the full circle piece that I think is also important is in the YAI journey, in my YAI journey, was also spaciousness to talk about my victimization with my family, which was very, very different. So I think that, I have been doing this work for almost 16 years, and had interned at NCCASA and now working as a full-time employee at NCCASA. And then the first time that we talked about, and when I say we, I'm talking about my family, primarily being my mother and my sister. That's my family, about my victimization as a result of YAI, right? It even doesn't matter if I had been doing the work for a long time, didn't matter that I had interned at NCCASA. It was because of YAI that those things started to happen. And now they happen in a very different way. And I think there's a better sense of understanding, even when it's hard. I think my family understands it in a different way. And I think around the education, around the questions, and managing and thinking about just my own victimization in a number of ways, and how it has impacted my mental health, and how to take care of those things, and how survivorship is fluid and ongoing and hard, right? And so I think that those same things around education and conversations and parents and engaging in the trauma, because of course, in talking about my trauma, my family's trauma, right, emerges as well too. And then figuring out how to coexist in those things and be healthy, and be alive, right?
Mm-hmm. Can you share? I'm curious, but how did YAI lead you to your family? What was that connection?
It was an article written in the newspaper that said what I said arrogantly at the beginning, that, oh, I'm sorry to this. So this is happening because I don't want anybody to feel like I did. I do my work every day as a survivor. And of course, that's a beautiful quote to go into a newspaper. And it went and it was published. And I knew that it might get some traction. And that led and sparked the conversation. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. Wow. That's, yeah, our work is particularly those of us in this movement, our work is our lives are the work, and the work is our lives. I'm really happy, particularly Monika, as for you as a head of, well, both of you working for a state coalition against sexual assault, to hear conversations around transformative justice, and for us and community accountability, and making the connection that it's not, we can't just have this theoretical oh, let's just have it, but really putting that work in terms of having those conversations with our families, and that's not easy work at all.
It's not easy work.
I mean, so often people are like, tell white folks, you have to talk to your family members about white supremacy, all, as well. Many are survivors as well. But just that conversation is so critical. I mean, I know in my family, I'm kind of known as a rape lady in terms of, someone who people can come to for support and also resources. And I have definitely been solicited and unsolicited as an advocate for young people in my family. And in here, and even in not only just for the young people, but just conversations that I don't even think people were, have just even aware of when we talk about fast girls or, just these kinds of things that, you have to say, hey, what are you saying? Just like that. And sometimes you're like, oh, I don't want to disrupt this moment. We're like sitting around table playing cards or watching TV, but I can't let it go.
I know. And I have a very large family, so my rape lady is really large and extensive. Because my work is my life. And so, like I said, I started before I took the job, I explained to my family what this meant for me. And ultimately, now 25 years later, even my husband, everybody who's ever interfaced with me understands that this is who I am, and I'm always going to talk about it, and I have no shame about talking about it. And what that yielded was they have no shame at calling me and be like, can you talk to my friend's friend about this thing? And can you write this letter for my friend's friend? And, it also led me to the work that I've done also around support for those who cause harm. I mean, one of the things I'm most proud of is the work that we've done in North Carolina we had a small conversation with like 3 colleagues, and one of them was a therapist, and she said, I think this is some work we should invest in. And it really was for me, especially because I had very clear visual of who I was talking about. And that is, how do we provide treatment for young, primarily boys, and male identified, but for young people who are already experiencing sexual deviance because of their own sexual trauma. So how do we interrupt before there's a first time perpetration? And it's been 10 years, and last year was North Carolina's first year of implementing a program for kids that's cognitive behavior therapy. And it really is based on really having families be able to recognize those things early on in a child, even if they have not actually recognized child sexual abuse has happened to them, but to really start to recognize and engage in therapy. And it has been hard to fund, but an amazing work that we've seen for young kids. And absolutely also for parents. Quite frankly, I believe it probably was an easier way for them to engage in therapeutic services for Black kids especially, is because they didn't actually have to name the thing. They just had to be able to identify some concerning behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, that's a large part of what I also was hearing from my family is, okay, well then what do you do once somebody has done that? If we're not going to call the police, if they're not going to go to jail, what do we do? What does the intervention look like in our homes? And that's, and when you go back for me, when I think about love and accountability, it is, I love you. I feel like what I heard my family saying is, okay, we love them, but what's the accountability if that's what you're telling me is needed? Because to be clear, what they really were saying is, I ain't calling the police.
Right.
Like, I'm just not. So
Right.
What other alternative is that? And what does that intervention look like? And for me, for the first, I know 2 kids personally in my circle who's gone through it. I mean, that's life-changing, because that's the work that I've been invested in for 25 years is across the entire spectrum to really figure out how we change who we are and what happens in our homes, even when we're not going to include law enforcement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I see we already have a question, but I want to ask one more question and we can open up for broader dialogue. And that is just in the role of you're working. So there's this mentorship and love and connection that you 2 share, right? That started in NCCASA, but definitely sounds like it transcends the institution itself. But really thinking about you 2, you, Monika, as executive director, and then, and Tracy, well, not now, because I guess you weren't back in the day, executive director in 25 years ago, but just this conversation, or maybe you were, just this conversation around supporting interns, supporting staff when you are the ED, you know, and when, if staff are clearly struggling or dealing with PTSD, you know, like just talking about that relationship. How do we invite people in rather than throw them out?
Ooh, Aishah. So I should start with, you know, I'm not only am I Black, I'm a Southerner, so I'm quite direct. And I prepare everybody who works with and for me that I am that way. And, you know, so for me, that means a clear transparency as soon as somebody comes. And I will also say, and Tracy can speak into this, you know, I've learned all the wrong things that I did so I became ED with Tracy, right? Like, so she really, it's like I only have one child, but it's like the first child gets to really figure out how to parent on them. I really figured out how to be an ED on Tracy, essentially. And so I made a lot of mistakes because I was very direct, like, okay, well, do you have a therapist? You need to get a therapist. That didn't work on Tracy 20 years ago. It didn't work on Tracy 60 years ago, but I really figured out how to still be direct but soften the approach. And so that really is around, you know, this movement of self-care. So I say to everyone, and it's up to them how they disclose, whether they're child sexual abuse survivors or adult survivors of rape, but that in this work, my belief is I see my staff as my family, and therefore I want my family to be healthy and whole. And to believe that you are healthy and whole, I need to know how you're going to contribute to that, and then how do I contribute to that. And so my relationship with every single staff person is different. Some of them are like, check me. When you see me going down a rabbit hole because I don't have the ability to pull myself or recognize my own triggers, can you do that for me? So for some of them, it's I see the triggers and I bring them in, and we have a conversation and we have our own plan of how they're going to take care of themselves. For some, they're far more kind of advanced. They're like, here's my list. Here's how I'm going to tell you what I need. Because what I say when they come on staff is, we work in very difficult work. It's complicated. And my relationship with you is probably going to be unlike any other supervisor you have. And that is an open conversation, both about who I am and all of my own challenges and struggles and the way that my body experiences trauma, because it does, and the triggers that I have. And I need you to do that for me, for us to do work to actually disrupt sexual violence in this state. Because the only way we can do it in the state is being honest with each other and really being in community. And community to me is being able, as they know I say, is tap me on the shoulder and be like, I gotta tap out right now. And that's okay. And I think giving permission is something that most supervisors don't realize that you need to do, is offer the permission for people to take the time and space to heal. And recognizing that that is not a ding on your performance report, right? Like those things are not tied to me, right? The way that I evaluate the way that you do your work is not about your ability when you need to be tapping out and taking care of yourself. Because I believe that we're all better in this work when we're good, and when we're not, we need to take a break. And so we have a very open way about that. And sometimes if people don't do it, you know, I do it for them. I say, okay, well, we're all done for today. Everybody, we're done. Because sometimes even I can't tap out because it feels overwhelming. And so if I acknowledge that about myself, because you feel responsible and you feel like if you tap out, somebody's going to be missing something. And it's required me to be very self-aware about who I am in order to be the best kind of supervisor and mentor to the people who work with me.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So it's been a 20-year process, and I hope I'm better today than I was yesterday. But every day is really about my own self-discovery and making sure I'm extending that same love and grace. And that's my favorite thing at NCCASA is I believe in granting people grace. That means grant yourself some grace and space. And I do the same for other people to take care of each other.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. Did you want to add anything, Tracy?
Yeah, I think the couple of things is like, our relationship has been direct from day one. When I came to interview with Monika, I had a horrendous email address, and she was like, I don't know you, but I'm gonna need you to change all of that. You'll never get a job. Okay, right. And so, and I think the other thing about it is, I think just how victimization plays out in a number of ways, and to be accountable for that in the workplace. And because victimization, when not cared for, acknowledged, right, can really harm. And so to be accountable to that, and sometimes that accountability, sometimes you can't do it for yourself initially, but you can do it for others in your life who you love. And I think that is my mental health journey, right? And I'm not saying because I have a therapist and I'm acknowledged it that I don't harm, but I also can stand in the accountability when it does. And so I think that has just been really, really life-changing to be able to have that permission to take care of myself and be challenged in a way and accountable when things were really, really rough. Monika asked me one of the most pivotal questions anybody's ever asked me: do you want to live or you want to die? And it wasn't about like a physical death. It was like, if you don't figure this out, because she's never questioned my talent or skill sets. It was like, get your shit together, right? Because if you don't, right, the gifts that you have been bestowed and what you can do, you won't be able to figure out your path and be on a good journey to health and wellness. And that was really difficult for me, which leads into a little bit about that conversation. The question is, like, for me, childhood sexual abuse, you got to understand, receiving love and being vulnerable to love were, I think, the root of a lot of the struggles in me trying to find my space, because I didn't know if it was real. Or if it would go away if I made a mistake. And so in valuing Monika, she's still the most fascinating person I've ever met, right? And not wanting to disappoint. And so I think all of those things play into like the trauma and the mental wellness and the self-care and all of those pieces. So getting to love was a long winding road. As a result of childhood sexual abuse.
Yeah.
We never talked about this before, Monika. Like, we talk about this stuff, y'all, all the time, but we never use this language or have this kind of space. It's like the unspoken, like we talk about this in our way.
Yeah.
But
I would agree. We don't talk about it in our work way.
In our work way, right? But we talk about it, but no, I think that's what it was. It was like, oh, if I mess up, I can't figure out how to work, because I didn't know how to work at all either. Like, that's another piece of the love and accountability. I should have been fired probably the first 5 years. Just, yeah, we can have another conversation about that, of what not to do. But it was also this thing, like, I see you and I need you to get together, and then like, well, I don't want to disappoint you, and if I make a mistake, you're not going to love me, and all these other things, because all these different factors, and it's grief, right? My grandmother was my person and died right after my internship at NCCASA, literally the next day. And so all of that manifests in that way, and to be open to love and accountability in a way in which she held me accountable didn't feel real, because a lot of the ways in which Monika shows up for me in our personal relationship is the same way that my grandma loved me. And that shit is terrifying, because she's gone, and that was a void I thought would never be filled. Right? And all the things that I've been able to figure out along my journey there have helped me. Like, yeah, I talk to my dad, like all kinds of stuff, like all these things that I've been able to do. Like, I'm better to be able to date. Like, I'm just in a different place. It's not perfect. It's flawed, just like all of us are, but in a better place than I'm not the same person I was a year ago, 6 months ago, however many days ago we've been in quarantine. But I know I'm not the same person I was when I came to NCCASA, because addressing trauma, addressing being able to be my full self, acknowledging I have a lot of skill sets and I have broken self-esteem, but I can still be successful, and I still know how to work, right? And not honing in on what I didn't have, and really trying to look at life in the work in a space of abundance.
No, that's powerful.
That's a lot, but like, that's
all. You've addressed PTSD, work, compassion, I mean, all of it in the workplace. And you all are very fortunate that you all have, a lot of workplaces, people are not, and it's not required that you have deep feelings for the person who is your supervisor, or, I don't know how you all define your dynamic, but I'm just saying but it's really powerful, and just such a reminder of how so many of us, and when I say us, I mean us, Aishah's included, are wounded, and we walk with our trauma, and we bring that trauma to the work as survivor advocates, activists, cultural workers, and we learn, right? And so that's some of the things I think is so important, is that all these things are on such a spectrum, and it's back to that love with accountability, and how do we create space for that.
And this is not like, absolutely, you're right. This isn't a thing where you're like, oh, let's go into space and replicate Tracy and Monika's relationship.
Right.
Wouldn't if I?
We've had to tell people this.
Yeah, that's what I want to say. I want people to feel like, well, I don't have that with my executive.
No, I don't want y'all to have that. Like, nope, you're not supposed to. Well, I'm not saying that. We are built for our interaction, and people ask, and you also got to know, like, this is hard for. It's unique in a way that the people in our lives don't question it, just understand it as so, right? Because of the work that comes along with it. And we are unique, not asking people to do that in any way. However, there are tenets of this story and this interaction and this connection to another human being. We're not related. Like I'm from all of this.
I love that you're from North Carolina now. I heard you.
I do. Like, I do pay taxes here, so I guess so. Like, yeah, I guess. I vote here, so yeah, I am from here. But I think there are tenets around understanding people and relationships and the things that survivors can show up with in doing this work. That are tenets for supervision, relationship building, and get this, service delivery, to understand that we're all complex human beings and we come with all these things. And I think, like, one of the most valuable things, like, that I've learned about this is to take a millisecond and realize that when we are in relationship with each other, everything ain't about you. Like, when I came to NCCASA, I was talking about myself in third person, like, oh, Tracy, right? Like, who the hell? You talking about yourself? Like, no, but all those things, and like, no, and consideration that we all have complex lives, but each and every day we wake up and we try to commit to do this work in a meaningful way, and we don't know what nobody woke up to or went to bed with last night, and to acknowledge that in relationships and how we interface. Survivorship is fluid, and every time I think I'm done with some part, there should come right back like tenfold, right? And staying in that process of accountability and what that looks like, because it does impact work. And again, I would say it was never a question about skill sets or anything about that. It was like, hey, leadership development, I believe mentorship is about 80% relational and 20% that work, right? Because if you're not together or in a good place, none of the work can be done to your fullest capability and capacity. That's my story, not speaking for a coalition of survivors. And the folks who work at NCCASA, that was mine. Like, if you can do this, then you will be able to do any of the work that you desire to be able to do.
Yeah. And Aishah, Tracy's right. There are tenets, but definitely I don't recommend anybody try to emulate this, because it really was almost organic, right? Like, neither one of us met each other and was like, this is it, we're together. It was organic, and and I am a very religious person, so I believe that they're just things that are divine for whatever reason, and I do think it was for the purpose of both of our well-beings and success, was to have this organic relationship. But there are certainly tenets, as I said, that I share with each of my employees, and I'm very clear, it is not easy to work with me if you believe that you're just coming to work to go to work, because that's not the culture of the organization that we've created. Is we're a culture of relationships. And so people absolutely feel, I've had people say, this is hard, I can't work here. And I acknowledge, and I'm okay with that, but we have to know that I expect people to be in relationship. because I don't really believe, so love is a strong word for people you work with, but so that's why I use, kind of, for me in that space is relational, is when you're relational, I can hold you accountable very differently if we've established who we are right here. So I always say to people, like, this is my heart work. So what I give to you is from the heart. So when you open up, you can receive whatever accountability, and I can receive whatever accountability in a very different way if we're in relationship.
Mm-hmm.
It is when people are not in relationship that certainly I can feel, and I openly own, I can feel big. I can feel overwhelming to people because I'm calling people to do something that people don't want to do in the workplace. And I believe in order to really change the way that we do our work and to really impact the culture of rape culture, that we have to be in relationship. Sexual violence happens in the context of relationship. And so we don't acknowledge relationship as a value system, as advocates and activists who are on the front line, then that shows up when we're working with survivors. And so, and I reserve the right for people to disagree, but everybody in North Carolina knows that's how I show up to do my work, is I'm going to be in relationship with you, because I believe that's how we change the world, is in relationship. And so that's the offering that I do make to everybody at NCCASA. And I acknowledge that everybody can't take it, because to Tracy's point, I had to say to her, like, this is your choice. But this is the culture that we're going to create here, because I want to have a space where survivors know that they come into this place and it's not just their work, but they bring their full authentic self so that they can then be well on the front lines.
Well, I want to pose this question that Dominique Courts asked, and she said, what are some, I don't know your pronouns, and excuse me. So the question is, what are some of the ways that learning about love is complicated by child sexual abuse? What are critical parts of that process of unlearning abuse as love and getting to a healthy understanding and practice of love as an adult who survived sexual abuse as a child?
Ooh. Yeah, I'm like, I kept reading the question. I was like, well, we probably need to break that down, all three of us.
I know, me too. I saw it. I was like, okay, we got to get to that.
Jumping, I don't know you, but okay, that's a question.
Powerful.
A very powerful question. So I would say that we should probably break it down in parts. And Aishah, I think we all should engage in this conversation, because again, yes, for those of you who've read the entire anthology, you know that for me, love is the core. That's right, Rachel. That's a question. and so I definitely would say, and I've never asked you this, Aishah, but in reading the anthology, I think that's what I would say to start this question off is, Tracy and I always both describe love as agape, unconditional love. And so I think to start this, that's what I would want to say is, we talk about how complicated love, how child abuse complicates love. Did you think about that when you started the anthology, especially the language that we all use now is from you?
Yeah. And let me say, and I always read about, I think, and that's my stuff, like about not being, like keeping it, like owning that I'm a survivor, but keeping my story out. Like, so right. Just thinking about the theoretical and blah, blah, blah. So love with accountability comes from my signing text messages and emails in 2015. So in 2015, I was 46, to my parents who are divorced, because I was saying what I was sharing with them, and that I loved them, but my love would no longer shield them from holding them accountable. And after I made a film titled Know the Rape documentary that came out in 2006. Both my parents are prominently featured in the film. My mother's a survivor. My father's a hardcore advocate for violence against women, or violence against women. And yet they didn't protect me. And at the time I was making I didn't deal with those contradictions. And so things really kind of came to a head after I saved my grandfather's life temporarily. He still died about 10 months later. And I realized, oh my God, I wasn't just protecting Pop, I was protecting my parents who were bystanders because I told them. And so that's where love with accountability came, because I was like saying, we got to have this conversation. And I was signing everything, love, and in capital with. WITH was all caps, accountability. So it's one of those things where the personal is political, like direct line. And in response to that part of the question, that I feel like, and, you know, and I've talked about this with my parents and writing about this, and will continue to write about this. It's like, I think it's very complex, right? Because I love Pop. I loved him. And he was also became the family hero for having, my grandmother had Alzheimer's, and he took care of her around the clock for 10 years. She never set foot in a nursing home. And if it wasn't for him, she would have been in one. I know that for a fact. So he became the hero, doting husband who took care of his wife. Yet he was the same person who terrorized me, and the same person who loved me, all these complications. So I didn't, what is love, right? What did that mean? And I think that I know it played itself out in relationships, romantic as well as platonic, around not knowing how to hold folks accountable who caused me harm, because I was like, well, they love me, including also causing harm to people who I cared about, and not knowing how to be held accountable. So it has been very, I mean, child sexual abuse, I mean, in terms of my personal life, has impacted every single component of it, of my life. And it has been my healing work in therapy. I'm a deeply spiritual person. I meditate, but therapy, meditation, and then being in community with other survivor advocates and activists, that has helped me to really parse out all of, you know, trauma, abuse, harm, and love, and understanding about harm being on a spectrum, and really moving, sexual violence is bad and harmful, but really moving from like, this person is this horrible, wretched person, really trying to hold all of those, because I think that's been part of the problem, right? Somebody commits sexual harm, they're horrible, and the hell with them. And I think that plays a role in us protecting folks. So if we could say they did a, you know, inexcusable act, or, you know, an act that must be held accountable, must be stopped, but we're not going to throw them away, then maybe that might create more space for us to hold people accountable and center survivors. My long answer.
Yeah, I mean, Trace.
And I think for me, like, the complexities around love have been around value and worth and vulnerability, which are places I think that I don't still struggle with, right? Am I worthy of being able to be loved? Am I worthy of good things that happen to me? Am I worthy of anybody loving me, flawed and all? And so I think that that is how it impacts me today, still, in trying to figure that out.
Yeah. And, you know, I think the thing that I would say here, Dominique, for me is, it was literally the opposite of what Tracy said for me. It's, I withhold my love as a way of protecting myself. And so the way that the way that it plays out is so different for each person, because again, love is so complicated, and the core for me of love is central to who we are. It's central to who we are. It's how babies of any species comes into this world, because love is almost, it's synonymous with nurturing or caregiving or taking care of. And you know, I think back to, you know, harkening back to what you said, Aishah, about your pop is, then this man took care of his wife in a way that most people can't do, because Alzheimer's is complex and hard. And so again, when you think about love and how you kind of, I think we have to own that love is complicated, and the way that we give or receive it is so rooted in how we've received and understood love for ourselves. And all of us build up these, you know, defense mechanisms or coping mechanisms, or both. And for me, protecting my heart was about not giving it. And it's, which ultimately results in how you receive it as well, like, to be very transparent. But right here in my head, it was about not giving it and holding on to it. And so when we think about, you know, the critical parts of the process of unlearning abuse as love and getting to the healthy place, is acknowledging that it's complicated. And it's also, and Tracy says this all the time, and she said it here today, that it's like this, it's ebbs and flows. And so as soon as you think you've learned something, you're at a new space in your life and something new comes. And it either cracks you open or shuts you down, or you just do nothing, right? Like fight, flight, or fright. And I think love does the same thing to us, is fight, flight, or fright. We make those decisions situational, and situations also depends on where we are in our own journeys at that time. And so I think a critical part for me of unlearning the abuse and bad habits that we have around love and moving to unhealthy is acknowledging that it's not static. Because if we are trying to achieve a static place around love, then I think for most of us as human beings, we won't find a way to heal. Because nothing, as long as we're breathing and life is in us, then nothing is really static. And I think love and understanding of love is complicated and therefore not static.
Yeah.
What about tenets for you all of unlearning?
I am my core of who I am. I'm gonna give you all of it, with no question of it. Like, it is who I am. And then in some spaces, not be able to hold anybody accountable for any of that. And then the other part is then you give it to me. I'm like, oh hell no, So like figuring out how to exist and be like, it's okay. And this is hard for me to even say today. It's okay for you to have a little bit of what you give back, what you give. Mm-hmm. And then the word that I'm really struggling to say, but I know it's true, and I have to say it, is also, you deserve those things too. So that's a part of the unlearning, right? And sometimes I'm saying that out loud. Most of the time I'm saying that out loud so that I can believe it. It ain't for nobody else, it's for me. And that's unlearning.
Mm-hmm. I think what I've learned, I actually just completed a series on boundaries, and one of the things that just really came up for me in terms of is in the past, I wouldn't bring my full self to in relationships and with people, with humans, and then once I would feel comfortable, then more and more the real me would come out. So it's almost kind of like I would be trying to figure out what was it that the person liked or wanted, and I would try to fit into that for fear of abandonment, fear of not being liked, etc. And then the real me emerges, and sometimes it's been tricky. So, and I think that, understanding that accountability is hard work. And not only, it's easier to seek it or say, well, I want people to be accountable, than it is to give it. That's what I've been learning. And recognizing the ways in which I have caused harm and I'm capable of causing harm, and kind of sitting or in the fire, standing in fire, just to be with that discomfort and not to deflect. So I think that these are kind of tenets that I've been really working a lot with and learning.
Boundaries is a great one. I mean, that I think that's a constant struggle too.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, boundaries is forever for me. The next question is, my name is Crystal. I am Mexican and queer. I work as an activist in the Central Valley in California. I would like to voice right now your book, Save My Life. Ooh, Aishah, thank you.
Oh, Aishah.
Yeah, and continues impacting my work. I found words, validation, and discovered transformative ways to set boundaries without shaming myself. My journey has taken me to go deeper in my relationship with pleasure, which as a survivor is very complex. Can you share more about how you have found balance in your relationship with pleasure in your work? Whew,
I know.
These questions, y'all are good deep. Woo.
They brought the questions today.
They really did. I was like, wow, I appreciate it. And thank you for just the affirmation of the book, and for, just this work. And my own work, and you, Tracy, and Monika, and all of the contributors' work. It's hard, and I think it's very courageous for folks to put themselves out there. For me, I want to say, I struggle with finding balance between pleasure and work. Like, I feel like I have to work. I'm learning, and I feel really fortunate to be in a relationship of 3 years where that is, I found a partner, because it's been a rough road, let me tell you. And that's been about my work, my not being healthy. And it's not necessarily even always about the other people, it's about me. So I want to be really clear, but just to be able to find balance and joy. And so my partner really pushes and strives for that. And then I also am pushing and striving for it, but it is hard. And it's really hard in moments like this, in terms of the pandemic and all the pandemics, sexual violence, COVID, white supremacy, and just kind of feeling like I got to fight and work and struggle all the time, but I'm not a machine. And even in joy and pleasure can just be eating a healthy meal, just staring out of a window, taking some breath. It doesn't have to be, like a trip somewhere, and I'm not going on anybody's plane anytime soon. So, but I just think really just finding pleasure for me has been about, through my meditative practice, to really tapping within, and finding joy. And I just think it's so important as BIPOC people, for all of us, let me be very clear, not white people, everyone needs to find joy, but I think it is especially important for BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color, that we find joy, because it is a form of resistance. It's a form of resistance, not only in terms of white supremacy, but in terms of the trauma that we experience as children.
Yes. All you said. So I've been saying this a lot. My staff has definitely heard me say it. I've really used to literally, like you, Aishah, say to people, "Oh, my work, it does give me pleasure. It gives me great joy. I love it." But that was also my way of not creating a real separation to take care of me, right? Because, again, like I said, I can make the offering to people, but receiving the offering is just as hard. I am fortunate that I do, have a family and a tribe that believes in taking care of yourself and finding pleasure. I can't wait to hear Tracy's answer on this, because, one of the words that I keep using with her all the time is joy. Because one of the things for me in really dealing with racism and my true authentic self is, from a small town, I'm the Black friend people were talking about, I became very complicit because I saw that as a way of success, which truly meant denying and actively denying myself spaces of pleasure and joy. Because do we really deserve it? Because I really got to be on this grind to prove that as a Black woman, and especially a Southern Black woman, that I'm worth it, that I'm smart, that I have all these talents. And so one of the things that really I will say is a game changer for me is, the term Black girl magic and Black boy joy gave such clarity to me around the way I was raised in the South. Was don't do this, don't touch this, because of the fear that my family had of what that meant for me and how I would be judged as being based on the skin color, right? Don't touch this, don't look at that. You could be harmed because you're Black. All of those things took away what white America has as a natural way to be joyful, because those fears are not embedded in them from the time they can talk and walk. And I had to acknowledge, for me, so much of that denial was about fear, and fear that was instilled in me, legitimate fear at that time, but it persisted throughout my life. And so really recognizing that the grind wasn't going to change who I was or what my gifts were, and recognizing that we all owe it to ourselves to figure out how to experience joy and pleasure. And it really is, a choice that not everybody has. And I also acknowledge that circumstances take away options. And so recognizing that I am in a place in my life that I can make some choices, and that I have a tribe who pushes the choices. And the last thing I'll say is, I feel like that the NAP ministry, I'm going to be doing a commercial for them, because I go to it to remind me that rest is not lazy, because those are also part of the things that I was taught to, which also prohibit joy and pleasure.
And so we're so in sync. Monika exactly knows where I'm going to go about this word joy. Actually at last year's YI, right? Because YI is difficult and hard. You got people's most prized possession, they children. You want everybody to go back safe. You want to have these conversations. And so it's just tough in general. It's tough terrain to figure out for 96 hours of no sleep, right? And so, yeah, we started this conversation about joy. And Monika was like, I need you to have joy. And I was like, everybody don't get joy. And she was like, how really accountability, like, are you looking at all of this? Like all these kids, like a million people have called you Miss Tracy has been said a million times. They trust you. You get a chance. And I mean, it was rough about finding joy because it was one of those things I was clear on. And it was a great barrier because when she said that to me, I was like, everybody don't get that. And how dare you ask me to do that? Right? And what does that look like? And it was a struggle in figuring out, and I had to get there in a really different kind of way. And so I feel like I am in a relationship on finding joy in every possible thing. I have a gratitude practice. I'm reading a book called Boundaries by way of therapy and really just trying to find joy and abundance. And this is not where I was last year about this conversation around joy at all. And the fact that it sits on my palate and it's truthful in that, oh yeah, I got joy in that. Like that is monumental. And I think I'm committed to that journey, however, wherever it goes. And I know I can do that because of my tribe and my tribe leader.
Tracy and I also forgot to say one of the things that we're looking for. I'm going to use the word joy. She may not. Is that she's keeping a list of the things that we're going to eat post-COVID that gives. Oh, yeah. She knows that will give joy.
So like, yep, can we do this? Can we schedule some
asking the question that so much of this is we have placed an unrealistic value on joy and food, right? A conversation can be joy.
Yes, I love that. So we have one more question. We have 9 minutes left. It looks like a very deep question. I'm grateful for it, but this will be the last question. I also just wanted to say, Crystal, because I realized I didn't, I know Gabriella, it's part of my bio, but I just wanted to also acknowledge queer visibility as a lesbian. So I was like, oh, I didn't even say that. And I didn't, there was nothing that I read. So just thank you for your visibility. And as a queer woman of color, Black woman, just want to acknowledge that. So thank you. And Sydney Moon asked, thank you for your powerful testimonies and responses. Could you all share ways you see the movement to end intimate violence, gender-based violence, doing the work to disentangle itself from carceral responses to domestic and sexual violence? What path forward do you see for mainstream programs in particular to move from just learning about anti-racism and transformative justice to actively divesting from police and prisons as interventions? So I will defer to you all because you all are doing this work, literally.
Yeah. Thank you, Sydney, for the question. It is definitely a question that I've had probably literally 5 conversations this week, 2 on Monday and 1 all the other days so far this week. So at NCCASA, it's been a conversation that we've been having with our membership. Actually, the conference that you were at, Aishah, in North Carolina in 2018.
Yes.
I know that we started the conversation about what does divestment look like, and divestment meaning for people to opt in, what that looks like for them. So divesting financially, divesting in terms of seeing it as the only place for justice and healing for survivors, divesting from it being the place that we think it's the only way forward for our work. And so there's multiple ways that we've been talking about it. And the thing that I will say is there is no uniform way that people see this. And everybody is recognizing, there's bills right now in Congress, both on the House and the Senate side. There's hashtag defund and defund the police. There's hashtag abolish law enforcement. All of those things are not a monolith for people, for Black people or any people of color. So I had a conversation just yesterday around, what does it mean when for our Native and Indigenous sisters who are working on the missing and missing and murdered Indigenous women, and they're working with law enforcement? What does it mean for Black folk who are looking at changing the 8 points based on the 8 minutes and 49 seconds that George Floyd was gasping for breath? Like, all of those things are a piece. And what I say to people is, there's not one answer, and it's complicated, just like love and all the things that we've talked about. But for me, what is certain is survivors who want to use the criminal legal system in North Carolina, that percentage is 25% that even get to interface with it. So that already says to me, if we're seeing over 10,000 survivors and less than 25% of those ever got to even interface by choice of the criminal legal system, that is not, then 25% of your work can be there, but 100% of our work certainly should not be, because 100% of our survivors are not there. So for me, in the work, it's about I have a personal opinion, but in the work, it is about connecting sexual violence to the carceral approach and the relationship with law enforcement. And, Aishah mentioned this very early on about, what is it? How can we talk about white supremacy and ignore child sexual abuse, or how do we balance those? And I think the same thing is true for those of us who do this work. And NCCASA has been on like I said, a lengthy journey around that conversation. And really where we stand true is where we'd like to see the investment going, is where the 75% of our survivors find their healing and justice. And it's not in the criminal legal system. And those who are in the criminal legal system and choose that as a way forward, our job is to support every option that survivors come to us for. We're not going to parcel out and say we're not going to work with survivors who don't see that as their work. But what we see investing in is mental health services and healthcare for every single person in every single community. What we see is an investment in our agencies that actually meet the needs of individuals based on how they choose to identify in that space. So that means, and NCCASA folks know, that we've started investing our own funding in non-rape crisis centers that are sanctioned by the state, that we've invested in organizations who said, we have this pocket of people that really need these services around sexual assault, and we're going to fund those innovative services, because if there's survivors there, that's where our investment is. And so really what I say to people is, the way that you choose to do this in your work world is totally, I think, across many ways that you can do this, but that's the way that we've chosen at NCCASA to do it in our work world, is really look at where our survivors are, what they're asking for, and then how do we actually really advocate in those ways that are important to those survivors, whether they're using a system that we believe is a system that's built and rooted in systemic racism, but because we do our work at an intersection, we believe that those intersections are defined by our survivors, and really where we really want to invest is the support and healing journey of survivors. And I totally have a personal opinion that I'm happy to also share. Trace?
And I echo all those sentiments. And I also want to say that these are conversations that are not only happening in our state, but also by way of a lot of national conversations with varied statewide coalitions, territorial-wide coalitions. And for me, my investment is to follow the truth and follow young people and understand that they are leaders, and that's the investment that I really hope that we think about in how we think about healing in the conversations that we had today. So echoing all those sentiments, and for me, I'm following the truth of young people in multiple ways.
And recognizing that that's also diverse, very diverse.
Yep. And I want to, and I don't mean to do this on the last 3 minutes of our webinar, but one of the things I've been thinking about as a survivor, as a survivor, I want to be a survivor who really believes in defunding, eliminating the police, defunding, abolishing the prisons. I'm really very, very clear about that. And I think that I find myself walking an interesting line. On the one hand, I'm demanding justice for the police who murdered Breonna Taylor, the police who murdered George Floyd, the white supremacists who murdered Ahmaud Arbery, right? So I'm demanding justice. And right now, justice means courts, jail. So if I'm demanding justice, and I have been, let me be very clear, then what am I saying for or to survivors who also say they are demanding justice? So this is stuff that I'm grappling with. I don't have the answers, but I'm just like, okay, like what am I inadvertently saying? That when you murder somebody, then you can go to jail, but if you rape somebody, you shouldn't, you know? So this is, and so I share that to say that it's complex and complicated and all of these layers and issues. And I hope that as we move forward, that we really are, in the words of Audre Lorde, deliberate and intentional, and don't come up with quick fixes that ultimately harm people down the road, that we really think, because this is a powerful and potent moment where a lot of incredible things that I never thought was even possible, I'm seeing happen. So what do we do in these moments that center survivors, that centers justice, and not necessarily carceral justice, but justice, that we think about these things and eradicates rape culture and white supremacy.
Well, actually, you said it. That's well said.
Yeah,
I think that's what we all should be doing, is we all should be grappling with the complexities of this. And for me, what grappling means is we will not settle for this quick fix, that we will invest time and energy in this conversation beyond the moment. Because as a country, we have a habit of being in the moment, and we're here for it. The dust settles and we're back to norm. And so I certainly hope the people who are engaging with us now and having this hard conversation will continue to grapple with the complexities of what does it really mean to want justice on one hand, but also want to reinvest in community on the other. And quite frankly, can we be big enough and bold enough to accept that we spent trillions of dollars in this country in the last 90 days. So truly, I think we should be able grappling with, can we do both?
And I am also sitting and for me, I'm like, oh, I gotta unlearn policing that I done taught. Like we personally police in a number of ways. Like, did you do this? Oh, I'm gonna like that, all of that, like that we have been taught about personal, like what we do in policing, like we're watching folks police with the device, right? Just in multiple ways to hold and find accountability. And then what is that going to be in the long run? Like, you can police here, but not police here. And how do you unearth like how we have been conditioned and socialized around policing? Because it's bigger than a badge and defunding, but it really is getting to the title of the book, Digging Up the Roots, right? Maybe that's the next book, Digging Up the Roots of Policing in Black and Brown Bodies. Like, there we go. I'll sell that one to you for free. But like, there we go. Like, maybe that's the next one.
Look at you. Yeah. Thank you. I will wrap up by saying Gabriella is behind the scenes. We could not, none of this would be possible without your work. She's training NCCASA on the screen, but none of this is possible without your behind the scenes and your complete, like, she has done a great job of listing all the ways to connect with Aishah and Love with Accountability, how to purchase, how to look at resources, how to look at this later on our YouTube channel. Gabriella, thank you for always being so excellent. And as Tracy says, you're the GOAT of our virtual technology. And thank you all for joining us. And Aishah, again, third time, absolutely, Aishah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Monika, Tracy, and Gabriella. I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm not going to check in with you anymore. It's been amazing. A month of checking in and making this happen. Love NCCASA and look forward to when we can gather safely in person.
Absolutely. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.